The best old-time radio from people you trust. The Radio Nostalgia Network, where the oldies are still young.
In the dream, you are falling, lost in the listening distance, as dark locks in.
The Violet Car.
It was a cold and wet November afternoon when I left London to go to Charleston on the Sussex Downs. I am a nurse by profession and had been engaged by Mr. Robert Eldridge to attend on his wife. It was, he had explained, a mental case. By the time the station fly dropped me off at the house, it was early evening. The wind drove the rain almost horizontally, but although the lights glowed from curtained windows, there was no other sign of life. I felt for the knocker and rapped smartly. A bolt ground back, a key turned, and framed in the doorway were two expectant but rather anxious faces, which I took to be those of my new employer and his wife. "Come in. Oh, come in," said Mrs. Eldridge. I went in, blinking at the light. Mr. Eldridge called a servant, and between them they carried my box upstairs. Mrs. Eldridge took my arm and led me into a low, square, but homely room. In the lamplight, I turned to look at her. She was small and thin. Her hair, her face, and her hands were of the same tint of greyish yellow. "Oh, I am so glad you've come," she said very softly. "I hope I shall be able to make you comfortable." She had a gentle, urgent way of speaking that was very winning. "I'm sure I shall be very comfortable," I said, "but it is I that am to take care of you. Have you been ill long?" "It's not me that's ill, really," she said. "It's him." "I see," said I. "One must never contradict them. It only aggravates their disorder." "The reason—" she was beginning, when his foot sounded on the stairs and she fluttered off to get candles and hot water. He came in and shut the door. A fair, bearded, elderly man, quite ordinary. "You'll take care of her," he said. "I don't want her to get talking to people. She fancies things." "What form do the illusions take?" I asked prosaically. "She thinks I'm mad," he said. "And she can't hear things that I can hear, see things that I can see, and she can't smell things." After I'd been in the house a few days, life at the farm started to come into focus, as strange surroundings do after a while. Mr. and Mrs. Eldridge seemed to be very fond of each other, but they had a way of showing this fondness that told that they had known sorrow and had borne it together. Morning found them fairly cheerful, but after dinner, taken early, they seemed to grow more and more depressed. Just as dusk was falling, they always went for a walk together across the downs towards the sea. They invariably returned from this walk pale and dejected. Sometimes Mrs. Eldridge would cry afterwards alone in their bedroom, while he shut himself up in the little room they called the office. After supper, they always made an effort to be cheerful. But I observed in Mrs. Eldridge no sign of mental derangement, save in the persistent belief that her husband was deranged. "I ought not to stay," I said to her one afternoon as we stood at the open door. It was February now, and the snowdrops were thick in tufts beside the flagged path. "You are quite well, both of you. I oughtn't to be taking your money and doing nothing for it." "You're doing everything," she said. "You don't know how much you're doing." After a very long pause, she said very quietly and distinctly, "He sees things that no one else sees, and hears things that no one else hears, and smells things that you can't smell if you're standing there beside him." I remembered with a sudden smile his words to me on the morning of my arrival. "She can't see or hear or smell." Her voice was so sane, so sweet. It came to me all of a sudden that I did not know to which of the two I owed my service. "Have you any idea why?" I asked her. She caught at my arm. "Our daughter Bessie was killed by a motor," she said. "Of course, they said it was an accident. The motor was a violet colour. They go into mourning for queens with Violet, don't they?" she added. "And my Bessie, she was a queen. So that was all right, wasn't it?" I told myself now that I saw that the woman was not normal, and I saw why. It was grief that had turned her brain. One evening, I was walking on the downs high above the English Channel. I struck a road that led quite unexpectedly into turf and furze bushes. Just as suddenly I found myself at the cliff's edge, watching the sea pounding the rocks below me. I turned back, reaching first the road, and then a deep banked lane bordered with high hedges. It was her voice that I heard first. "No, no," she cried. "There's nothing." "I tell you, yes," he replied. "Can't you hear it? That panting sound. Stand back, I tell you, it's close upon us." I came round the corner of the lane then, and as I came, I saw him catch her arm and throw her against the hedge, violently, as though the danger he feared were indeed close upon them. I stopped behind the turn of the hedge and stepped back. They had not seen me. Her eyes were on his face, and they held a world of pity, love, agony. His face was set in a mask of terror, and his eyes moved quickly as though they followed down the lane the swift passage of something that neither she nor I could see. Next moment he was cowering, pressing his body into the hedge, his face hidden in his hands and his whole body trembling. She had her arms round him. "Come home, Robert," she said. "Come home. It's all your fancy. Come home with your wife that loves you." They went home. Later, the next day, I asked her to come to my room to look at a new blouse I had bought. I told her what I had seen in the lane the evening before. She sat down in the chintz-covered armchair by the window and broke into wild weeping. I stood by her and soothed her as well as I could. "It's a comfort to know," she said at last. "I haven't known what to believe. Many a time lately I've wondered whether, after all, it could be me that was mad, like he said. It's the violet-coloured car he sees, the one that killed our Bessie. Every day up there in the lane, he says he hears it, and that he smells the petrol. And you can see he hears it, and you can see he sees it. It haunts him as if it was a ghost. You see, it was he that picked her up after the car went over her. He saw her just as they had left her, lying in the dust. But there was a judgment on them. The very night of the funeral, that violet car went over the cliff, dashed to pieces every soul in it. There's my old man calling. Oh, poor old dear. He wants me to go out with him." She went, all in a hurry, and in her hurry slipped on the stairs and twisted her ankle. It all happened in a minute, and it was a bad sprain. When I had bound it up, and she was on the sofa, she looked at him, standing as if he were undecided, staring out at the window with his cap in his hand, and then she looked at me. "Mr. Eldridge mustn't miss his walk," she said. "You go with him, my dear. A breath of air will do you good." As soon as we got outside the house, I tackled him. "Tell me about the violet car," I said, full of that importance, that conscious competence that one feels in the presence of other people's troubles. He looked at me. "I will tell you, by God," he said. "I couldn't tell her, but I can tell you, without losing my soul more than it's lost already. The man that killed my girl was new down here, and he hadn't any eyes or ears, or he'd have known me, seeing we'd been face to face at the inquest. And you'd have thought he'd have stayed at home that one day, with the blinds drawn down, but not he. He was swirling and swivelling all about the country in his cursed car, the very time we were burying her. And at dusk, there was a mist coming up. He comes up behind me in this very lane, and I stood back, and he pulls up, and he calls out with his damned lights full in my face. 'Can you tell me the way to Hexham, my man?' says he. I didn't mean to do it, but before I knew anything I'd said it. Straight ahead, keep straight ahead. Then he was off. I ran after him to try to stop him. But what's the use of running after a car? And he kept straight on, down the lane, through the firs, and then right over the cliff. And every day since then, the car comes by, the car that nobody can see but me, and it keeps straight on. Mr. Eldridge, I said, you should go back home to be with your wife. She has a bad sprain. She needs you. No, he said earnestly. Somebody has to see that car every day as long as I live. Then I should be the one to see it tonight. No, he repeated. I'm the only person who deserves to see it. I argued with him, and I put all my will and all my energy into my persuasions until suddenly, like a door that you've been trying to open and that has resisted every key until the last one, he gave way. Yes, I should go to the lane, and he would go back home. I stood in the deepening dusk, looking up towards the downs and the sea. There were pale stars. Everything was very still. I turned to look back down the lane, only to see that he had not gone back home, but had followed me. He was standing a dozen yards away, with his face turned from me towards a violet car that was shooting up the lane. I crushed myself back into the crackling bare hedge. As the car neared him, he started back. Then suddenly he cried out, "No! No more! No more!" With that, he flung himself down on the road in front of the car, and its great tyres passed over him. I got to him and got his head up. He was dead. I went to a cottage where a labourer was having tea. He got some men and a hurdle. When I told his wife, the first intelligible thing she said was, "It's better for him. Whatever he did, he's paid for now." So it looks as though she'd known, or guessed, more than he had thought. I stayed with her till her death. She did not live long. You think perhaps that the old man was knocked down and killed by a real motor, which happened to come that way of all ways, at that hour of all hours, and happened to be of all colours. Violet. Well, a real motor leaves its mark on you where it kills you. But when I lifted up that old man's head from the road, there was no mark on him, no blood, no broken bones. His hair was not disordered, nor his dress. There was not even a speck of mud on him, except where he had touched the road in falling. There were no tyre marks in the mud. The motor car that killed him came and went like a shadow. As he threw himself down, it swerved a little so that both its wheels should go over him. He died, the doctor said, of heart failure. I am the only person to know that he was killed by a violet car, which, having killed him, went noiselessly away towards the sea. What's more, there was no one in that car. It was just a violet car that moved along the lanes, swiftly, silently, and empty.
Charlotte Emerson was reading The Violet Car by E. Nesbit, abridged by Roy Apps. It was produced by Celia de Wolf and was a peer production for BBC Radio 4 Extra.